I'm John Batchelor. It is November 22nd, 1963, a day in infamy. That morning, President Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy are departing from a hotel in Fort Worth, Texas. One of our protagonists in the telling of a new book, The Oswalds by Paul Gregory. One of our protagonists is Paul's father, Pyotr Petrovich Grigoriev, an escapee from the Soviet Creature many years before, now gainfully employed as an oil engineer in a booming Texas. His office is in the Continental Life Insurance building nearby the hotel where the Kennedys have stayed overnight. He goes down with the other well-wishers to stand in front of the hotel as the president comes out and says a few words in a light rain. I welcome Paul Gregory because this story of the Oswalds, from the point of view of Paul as a young man and his father as a mature and very capable and translator of Russian, take us inside the Oswald marriage, and you can puzzle for yourself once again what motivated Lee Harvey Oswald to commit this monstrous act. Paul, congratulations, good evening. It's an overwhelming story, but I ask you to first stand in place of your father. What did he see that morning? What did he think?
Well, as you say, the Continental Life building was about half a block from Texas Hotel. So he went over, joined the crowd, a very enthusiastic and friendly crowd, by the way, which is an important point because there was concern of the Secret Service about sending Kennedy on this trip to Texas, which supposedly was dominated by crazy right-wing forces. So it is important to note that the crowd was very, very friendly. Few words. The president returns to the hotel, and there was a meeting of the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce, and that's where he delivered a speech. There was a demand to see Jackie, so Jackie had to make an appearance in her pink outfit, which became quite famous, of course. My father returned to his office after hearing the remarks by the president, did his work as a consulting engineer, came out around 1 o'clock, I guess, and noticed something was wrong. He asked passerby, what's going on? The president has been shot.
We go immediately to Norman, Oklahoma, the Oklahoma University of Oklahoma, where Paul is a student. That afternoon, he's going to class. He enters the class and he sits down, waiting for the lecture and the conversation to begin. A colleague of his, a classmate named Studebaker, enters the classroom and says, the president has been shot, all classes canceled. You can take us to that moment, Paul. You know that all of us remember that exact moment. What did you think at the time?
Well, what we students did was to head for the student union, where we knew there was a widescreen TV, widescreen by the standards of that day. So we sat there. The TV was tuned to CBS and Walter Cronkite, but most of the broadcasting was local. And we've all seen those pictures of Dealey Plaza, parents crouching above their children because of the expectation of another shot. Then Cronkite came on, and you could see something. He was going to announce something of great significance. And even Cronkite, the old pro, was in tears when he made the announcement. His voice broke, saying, and I think it was around 12:50, saying the president is dead. He then could not really contain himself, so he left the soundstage, and we were left with sitting there, strangers, not knowing really how to react. So we continued to watch the TV, And then there was an announcement. We have a suspect. He's being brought in. So within about 15 minutes of that announcement, they called out, they're bringing a suspect in. There was a rush of the reporters. The police station was full of reporters. It was like a madhouse, to tell the truth. And then they said they're bringing him in, and they showed then a relatively short man, that was Lee, surrounded by these very, very tall and brawny police and Secret Service. First shot of the suspect was of his face, which was bruised. And I got a good look and said, "That's Lee Harvey Oswald. I know that guy."
I know that guy right there, Paul.
Right there.
You take us to that moment. You knew who he was. No one else in the room knew anything. No one else in the country knew anything. They didn't even know if they had the right man. It was just a suspect surrounded by 10-gallon hats in the Dallas headquarters. That afternoon, you continue to watch television. I think you go back to your student room. What are your thoughts that afternoon, Paul? What are you expecting to happen to you, given that you did know that man very well?
Well, I knew that I would be called in for interviews it was the Secret Service that was really handling this. And I was indeed picked up the next morning at around 9 a.m. in the morning by the chief of police of Norman, Oklahoma, and by the Secret Service. My immediate thought upon seeing Lee was, well, they probably brought him in because he has something of a record as a deserter and a communist, etc. But probably within an hour, I said to myself, I think I know what has happened here. And from that point on, I never really doubted the fact that he did it, and he did it alone. I was able to repeat that feeling the next morning when I was taken to Oklahoma City for interrogation, as, by the way, I was labeled in the records as an associate of Oswald.
Yes,
So,
you remain part of the Warren Commission record in several instances, you and your father, which is why I wanted to start with your points of view that day. We're now going to go to 17 months before, at the same Continental Life Insurance building, and the same Paul's dad, Pete, when he first meets Lee Harvey Oswald. This is The Story of the Oswalds by Paul Gregory, just published. Paul Gregory's at the Hoover Institution, and now an untold account of Marina and Lee Oswald. The word chilling is inadequate, because we're about to understand who Lee Oswald was from the point of view of people who tried to help him, tried to help Marina, tried to help their daughter, their baby daughter, June, and eventually their baby daughter, Rachel. Helped them all in Fort Worth and Dallas for more than a year. It begins with Pete Gregory, who is a refugee from the Soviet creature many years before in the 1920s, but he's now well-employed and sophisticated and a volunteer of Russian teaching at the Fort Worth Public Library. One of his students, he does not know the name, one of his students gives him a call eventually, or suggests to her son, Lee Harvey Oswald, that he's a person to look to because he's a Russian speaker who can translate easily. Lee Harvey Oswald has arrived in town after a troubled history and is seeking employment. The Texas Employment Office, well-meaning and spontaneously, calls up Peter Gregory and asks if he'll interview this young man, see if his Russian skills are adequate. Paul, can you remind us what your father first made of Lee Harvey Oswald when he walked into that heavy wool suit in June of '62?
Well, my recollection is that Lee did come in, and he brought with him perhaps a manuscript of his historic diary, which he was trying to get published, and he wanted my father's support on that. But anyway, Lee came to my father's office and presented himself as a Russian speaker who had spent time, actually 3 years, in Minsk, USSR. My father had a Russian book section in his office, so he picked at random a book. It was probably about Siberia, and asked Lee to translate. And he was surprised that this young guy spoke quite passable and fluent Russian. He thought that perhaps Lee was a Pole or a Latvian. These are satellites, or were satellites, that where the population spoke Russian, but it was clearly they were not native speakers. So anyway, he wrote a "to whom it may concern" letter, stating that Lee Harvey Oswald is a fluent Russian speaker and is qualified for some work that involved the use of the language. For Lee, this is a very important meeting because he had hoped to avoid falling into the blue-collar trap, where he's working as a welder, as a steel engineer, person, et cetera, et cetera. And he very much hoped that his knowledge of language would land him a decent job. It didn't work out that way. Throughout this entire period of return to Fort Worth and then moved to Dallas, he worked as a welder for $1.25 an hour, which made him very bitter, by the way. It was around lunchtime, and my father customarily ate lunch in the Texas Hotel. He was rather curious about this young fellow and invited him to lunch in, by the way, something like 105-degree weather, with Lee in his heavy woolen jacket. So that was more a social meeting than a business meeting. Lee was very uncomfortable, my father could see, but when they parted, Lee said, "Here's my brother's telephone number. I'm living with him, with my wife and daughter. Maybe we should get together someday." And they parted on that basis.
Now we turn to Paul Gregory's memory. You first meet Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina Oswald, and it's your father's thinking. He's looking to be generous and help this young couple. And the idea is that you're going to take Russian lessons from Marina, who's a sophisticated and natural Russian speaker from Minsk in Belarus. That's now no longer part of the Soviet Empire. These are the Soviet Empire days, where all of the republics were bend a knee to Moscow. And what was your first impression of Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina when you met them, Paul?
My father, I happened to be home for the summer. My father had Robert Oswald, Lee's brother's, telephone number and the invitation. So my father called up, talked to the brother, Robert, very decent fellow. Robert then talked to Lee, and they decided that we should come over and get acquainted. So we got in the car, drove to West Fort Worth, found Robert's fairly modest ranch-style home. And it was at that point that I first met Lee and Marina and June, the infant daughter. It was a very pleasant conversation. It was difficult to get Lee to say anything. Lee was not a big talker, and so we sat around, and they had brought, we looked at picture albums. these were pleasant memories for Lee because at that point in his life, he actually had friends. I think the only time in his life where he actually had friends would have been that period from, I guess, 1958 to 1962. So we left. I can't say I have strong memories of that meeting. It was the first time I'd heard Lee speak Russian, and my Russian was pretty good at that time. And it was clear that he was not a native speaker.
Right.
It was clear that he did not really understand grammar. So what he could speak fluently, but with terrible grammar, which kind of dispels the one conspiracy theory that he was taken into some spy central where he would have been taught fluent and grammatical Russian, but that was not the case.
No, that's not Lee Harvey Oswald that you introduced us to. Whose first idea was it that you would take Russian lessons from Marina?
Well, as I recall, I was planning a trip to San Francisco where my aunt and uncle lived. They lived in the Russian immigrant community. So I was gone for a while. And when I came back, I think I made the suggestion, it's rare to have a real Russian speaker to practice with. And so I think it was my suggestion. Of course, Lee and Marina did not have a telephone, and they'd moved into their own duplex on Mercedes Street near Montgomery Wards. So we just got in the car, my father and I, we drove over, knocked on the door. Lee answered, and we arranged for me to go over, spend time with them, particularly with Marina, to brush up the Russian, and that we mentioned we would pay her some money for this. There was no discussion of how much, but it was when we did pay her the $35 at the end of my stay in Fort Worth, she regarded that as a fantastically large amount of money.
We have to underline here that the Oswalds have very few resources and no savings. And Lee Harvey Oswald maintains tight control on all the money he does earn, about $56 a week. So money is a constant worry, especially for Marina, who comes from a country of great deprivation. The book is The Oswalds, the untold story, the chilling, scary, amazing untold story of Marina and Lee Oswald. It is the summer of 1962. Paul's at home with his family and taking Russian conversation lessons from Marina Oswald, intending to pay Marina for her labor. They quickly establish a routine where Paul goes over perhaps twice a week, about 6:30 in the afternoon, after Lee Harvey Oswald has come home from his day labor. And then they sit and converse. One of the most vivid parts of the book to me, having read it in manuscript before, is when Paul comes into their modest room. There are very few conveniences. There's no fan, there's no air conditioning. This is a summer in Dallas, Fort Worth. And you see a Time magazine. Who's on the cover, Paul, and where did it come from?
That's something of a mystery. On the cover was none other than President Kennedy. I think I've solved the mystery, and the solution was that Lee had asked his brother to send him Time magazine when he was in Minsk. So that edition of Time magazine would have arrived when Lee was in Minsk, which means that he would have had to include that magazine in his possessions that were being sent to the United States. So for some reason, he wanted that, or they wanted that edition of Time on their coffee table. It was the only book on their coffee table, and it never changed its position in the whole time I was with them. It did give me occasion to sound out Marina about Kennedy, whether she knew who the president was, et cetera, et cetera. And her response was, he's very handsome, seems like a very good father. And Lee was listening as we were discussing this and was shaking his head in agreement. So there was never any time when either Lee or Marina expressed any negative feelings towards Kennedy.
All right, it is the summer of 62, late June, early July, into August, and Paul's at home, and he's hearing in pieces the story of how the Oswalds got to this condition in Fort Worth. They are poor, very poor. Marina is alone. She's a very sympathetic figure at this point. She's 21 years old, rail thin, and what she has during the day for any diversion whatsoever, she has no friends. She cannot travel. She goes across the street to Montgomery Ward. What does she do, Paul, with the baby? She's carrying June at the time.
This is an important part of the story. It might seem trivial to American listeners, but in Russia, it's very important to have what's called a kolyazka, which is a baby carriage. There was no kolyazka. Lee couldn't afford to buy a kolyazka. So as you say, when she would wander down the street just for entertainment and go into Montgomery Wards, which was a fountain of great wealth to Marina, when she would go anywhere, she had to carry June, who I guess was around 6 or 7, 8 months at the time. And whenever we went shopping together or did anything, someone had to carry June. This was a sign of failure for Lee. And later, when they were offered by Dallas Russians a free kolyazka, this sent him into a rage. And he never forgave those good Samaritans,
right,
who gifted them this kolyazka.
Marina's window shopping. She has no money. Oswald gives her $2 a week to get through the week, but she can't travel. Paul takes them on shopping expeditions sometimes in the evenings when he's over there for conversation, and they shop modestly for food for the week. Paul also gives them a tour of Fort Worth, of Dallas, the area, sometimes the country clubs, sometimes how ordinary people live, simple people live. But in all of this, Paul's picking up the story of how they came to be a couple. Paul, Minsk, Belarus. Marina is an orphan. Her father is dead, I believe. She lives with an aunt. And she's trained as a pharmacist, which isn't a high fancy degree. It's sort of like a clerk in an apteka, I believe, my memory of an
apteka, yes.
Apteka. But you learn that she came to America for a better life. And so therefore window shopping at Montgomery Ward was a dream for her. However, Paul, I learned that Lee Harvey Oswald resented everything about him, and we need to concentrate on him because Marina is so sympathetic. Did you register? You're a young man, you're a tennis star, you're in college, you have the world in front of you, you have an automobile. Did you register that something was odd about Lee Harvey Oswald? He's a Marine veteran. He says that he went to the same high school, Arlington High School, you did. And did you figure out how it is that he came to spend 3 years in Minsk and has all these odd, strange, hostile opinions of the world?
Well, it was very difficult to get anything out of Lee. Lee did not talk about himself. The thing he wanted least to talk about was why he deserted to the Soviet Union. In his FBI interviews in Fort Worth, where you can read the transcripts of these interviews, the one question where he would really dig in his heels and refuse to answer was, why did you go? To tell the truth, I still don't quite understand why he was so resistant to answering this question. And as we will see as the story proceeds, this seemed to be something he did not want discussed in front of Marina. I think it was another sign of failure. The image he wanted to present to the outside world and primarily to Marina was an intellectual, socialist, deep thinker, author who had written material such as his historic diary that would have great demand in the marketplace. So he was going to be an author, earning a good living, and so on. So he did, when Lee did not want to answer a question, he would simply clam up or steer the conversation elsewhere.
Paul establishes there are facts here. He never graduated from high school. His grammar was non-existent. Most of what he was doing was being a poseur. He alienated his Marine comrades, brought a pistol into the barracks and was punished for it, got into fistfights, is often violent, is routinely violent towards Marina. We need to follow that train here because meet the Dallas Russians. In a story of great tragedy, the Dallas Russians are the lightest moment, and it's very easy to like them. This is a community of about 50 in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. All at one point Russian speakers. Some are Poles, some are Balts from the Baltic states. Paul's dad, Pete, is a natural Russian speaker. Another one is George Buhi, who is the senior figure, something like Colonel Blimp of the famous English novels. He takes charge of the Dallas Russians, and in August of 1962, they all gather at the Gregory's for dinner. This is a very important telling scene. Paul can't be a better writer of theater pieces than to describe this scene. He tells me he remembers how they were seated at the table. The part that I like, Paul, is Mrs. Miller. She zeroes in on Lee Harvey Oswald expressing himself about life in the Soviet Union. And I paraphrase her, say, "You're crazy. It's a terrible place." What did he make of being confronted by the facts by the Dallas Russians at that dinner table?
Lee was seated to my left, and the Dallas Russians were opposite him. Anna Miller posed to Lee the question that he refused to answer even to the FBI, which is, why did you do it? Why did you do this crazy thing? This is a land of milk and honey, and you deserted it, etc. Lee went into something of a controlled rage, if there is such a thing, at that point, and his voice was raised. He was leaning back in the chair, sort of as a sign of great discomfort, and it almost came down to an outright verbal fisticuffs between him and Anna Miller, who came, by the way, from Ukraine and saw the famine and saw the worst of everything. At that point, George Buha, who was the leader of the Dallas Russian gang, decided we better end this evening before things get more tense. And so they decided it was time to leave. George Buha volunteered to drive them home. And there's great significance to this, because driving them home meant that he knew their address. And I could just see Lee saying to himself, now they know where we live. The end of isolating Marina is near. So this was a very, very significant moment in the story.
The Dallas Russians take up Marina as a charge to help her, to be generous towards her, to give her gifts, such as the pram. All of that at the same time, they're learning that Lee Harvey Oswald is a wife abuser, and Marina is kept as a prisoner. Marina, however, is not able to free herself. And during those next months, when Paul's back at school, the Dallas Russians do what they can and are frustrated by Lee Harvey Oswald. We need to turn to events that are in 1963. However, I mentioned that all of this now in retrospect looks obvious, that you're looking at a man in a rage with delusions and a poor education who has an adolescent sense of the world. That was not obvious in 1962 or 63. Paul Gregory is the book. The Oswalds is the story, the untold story, to my knowledge, of Lee Harvey Oswald and his motivations, such as you can name them, for the murder and change of a president and the changing of American and Russian history. And Paul and I have talked about this book for years. I've read pieces of it. And now that I have the whole thing, I'm completely confounded. I thought I was figuring Lee Harvey Oswald out in the bits and pieces that Paul and I had talked about over the years. When you put it all together, there are leaps here that Lee Harvey Oswald, the immature, delusional, arrogant, and extremely violent young man, he makes leaps that you can't see coming. If this was a novel, I would say it lacks verisimilitude. So let's get on to what happens next. You're back at school. It's April of 1963. The Oswalds have been separated. They've come back. I believe at one point, Lee Harvey Oswald, Marina was living at a friend's house. She'd been given a place by the Dallas Russians to hide from Lee's abusing. He came by, got on his knees, begged her, wept. She went back with him. But it's now April 63. And I believe they're living in Dallas. You'll help me, Paul. I believe that at this point they're living in Dallas. And the night of April 10th, what does Lee do that night, and what does Marina make of it?
That night, Lee did not come home at the usual time. He came home very late, and he was visibly shaken. When she noticed that he was not home at the normal time, she looked through his things and found a letter to her, which contained, written in Russian, very bad Russian, by the way, which gave her directions as to what to do if he was not able to come home. And as I recall, there were instructions about a number of things, financial and so forth. He eventually came home around 11. He was quite agitated, very agitated, according to Marina. And he confessed to her that he had attempted to assassinate General Edwin Walker, who was a leader of the John Birch Society in the Dallas area. He had fired a single shot. He did not know if he hit the target. Marina obviously was quite upset about this, about his confession, and told him that he cannot try anything like this again. In later testimony, which is important, Marina did describe the fact that he put like 2 or 3 weeks of surveillance into this. So it was a well-planned operation where he was in the backyard of the house. She told Lee that this was it. If he tried anything like this again, she would leave him for good. And which brings, by the way, an important point, which was that at that point in time, Marina would have realized who he really was, that he was, to use a Texas expression, off his rocker. So the whole thing could have ended there had she contacted the Dallas Russians and told them what had happened, and they would have reported it to the FBI.
But she told no one. She told no one, and she didn't write it down. Is that correct, Paul? To our knowledge, she never conveyed the facts of April 10th and 11th to any other person.
She conveyed them to the Warren Commission.
Right.
In some detail.
After the assassination. I understand.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, a detail here also. The next month, May, is my note here, Paul. Oswald starts again beseeching the Soviets at this point for a visa to travel back to Russia. He changes his mind again after trying for General Walker. At this point, does he believe he's being pursued by the FBI because he shot at General Walker? Does he think he got away with it in May?
Well, I would say about a week after he tried to kill Walker, he moved to New Orleans. Marina remained behind. And it was in New Orleans that he was agitating for the Free Cuba Committee. So he was, at that point, trying to establish his credentials as a radical operative for Fidel Castro.
But he wanted to go back to Russia, didn't he, Paul?
No, well, this gives you some sense of how tricky Oswald was, because he understood that he did not want to go back to Russia and would probably not be welcome in Russia. So his last hope, really, and he was dissatisfied everywhere, but his last hope was Cuba. So he had to develop a plan to get to Cuba. According to Marina, at one point he was going to hijack a plane to Cuba, which was common in those days. But the simpler approach would be to get a visa to Cuba, where he could later perhaps call Marina to him. So his move to New Orleans was really aimed at establishing radical credentials.
I see.
So that he could go into the Cuban embassy in Mexico City and get a visa, not only to Cuba, but more importantly to the Soviet Union, because he could not get the Cuban visa without the Soviet visa. Very complicated.
He's writing Gus Hall, the Communist Party, who blows him off. He's making up stories about himself. He invents a character named Hidel, I believe, which is his nom de guerre. In other words, he's deep into delusions when he's in New Orleans. He then travels to Mexico City, as Paul just evidenced, trying to play off the Soviet embassy against the Cuban embassy in Mexico City. And what we're looking at is a man who's seeking some kind of elevation in his own mind, perhaps in the minds of the general public. Is very difficult. It's very incoherent at this point. It is now the summer of 1963. At this point, Paul, there is no indication whatsoever that he's planning to assassinate the president of the United States. Is that correct, Paul? All of these random events, bus to Mexico City, bus back to Dallas, no talk of killing Kennedy. Is that correct?
That is correct. If he had been granted the Cuban visa, which was what he was after, he would have gone to Cuba and would have been out of sight, out of mind, and making himself a pest in Cuba. So that is quite significant, obviously. And he had to convince not only the Cubans, but also the Soviets that he is pursued by the FBI. He's a real asset for communism, et cetera, et cetera.
Let's get on to November 22nd, 1963. Paul Gregory, the book is The Oswalds. It is November 23rd, the day after the murder. The day after the murder, not only of President Kennedy, but Officer Tippit by Lee Harvey Oswald, who was in custody at the Dallas Police Headquarters, surrounded by tall hats and tall men. However, in these events of these next days, we're going to introduce one new important character, Marguerite. Marguerite is 57 years old. As Paul describes her, dowdy, bespectacled, and a nurse. However, she's lived what Paul characterizes as a vagabond life. She was in that class that Pete Gregory gave as a volunteer at the Fort Worth Public Library. She knew him to name him to Lee Harvey Oswald, which is how Lee Oswald got to Pete's office back in 1962. But now she calls Pete Gregory asking for help. Paul, this is another momentous detail that lacks verisimilitude. The Marina Oswald and Marguerite Oswald are abducted by Life magazine photographers in the afternoon of the 22nd, who mean to make them a focus of Life magazine revelations. Time magazine with Kennedy on the cover from 1962, and now Life magazine spirits them to the Adolphus Hotel in Dallas, which you tell me is a luxury hotel, but they know that they can't stay there forever. And the Life photographers are going to get out of the way because, of course, you know, they've got the Secret Service and the FBI and everybody else looking to question them, because the immediate thought is there's a conspiracy. This man can't have acted alone. Who else knows about this? And they want to talk to the wife and the mother. The Life photographers probably wisely get out of the way by depositing them at the Executive Inn at Dallas Airport. And that's when Marguerite calls your dad. What does she want from your dad, Paul?
She called at 7 a.m. and this would have been the Friday, Saturday. It would be Sunday morning. She said, Mr. Gregory, first of all, she did not want to say who it was on the phone. She called up and said in a whimpering voice, we need help. We need someone to come and help us. Can you perhaps give us shelter? My father answered, well, who are you? She did not want to answer. Then he asked again, who are you? I don't talk to people who do not identify themselves. She said, well, I can't tell you that, but I was a student in your class. At that point, my father realized who this was. It was Marguerite. So he told Marguerite, first of all, he asked, where are you? And in what room are you? She answered that question and he said, don't move, don't do anything. I will come and give you assistance. Pete, at that point, after the phone conversation, called the Secret Service agent who was really in charge of the family, Mike Howard, who's still living, by the way.
Yes, Mike Howard is one of our protagonists, Paul. He's one of the heroes, one of the good guys.
No, he quite a nice, good guy. So anyway, my father called Mike Howard and told him where Marguerite and Marina were. Mike came and picked him up. They then linked up with Robert Oswald, who was driving in from Denton, Texas, and they met sort of halfway between Fort Worth and Dallas on what was then the turnpike. They then went to the Executive Inn, told Marguerite and Marina to pack up. We have to go immediately. Marguerite did not want to go anywhere. She began her campaign to rehabilitate her son, who she said was actually an agent working for the FBI and CIA, and he's not a presidential assassin. In fact, he's a hero who deserves to be, oh, well, at that point, Lee was still alive. But anyway, she started this story about her son being a hero, and she needed to stay nearby to give him assistance, et cetera, et cetera.
Detailed here, Paul.
Mm-hmm.
This is the first time your father's focused on Marguerite. Did he have an impression that he left in his memory about how he regarded her at this moment? Because you know very well in your story, she's a major figure here for what happened.
Well, the only thing he knew at that point was that there was this woman who had identified herself as a nurse who came to his language class.
Okay.
So he had no opinion.
Okay. And the Secret Servicemen, Howard and Kunkel, they didn't have an opinion. They just want to get them out of the Executive Inn because the whole world, plus all their photographers, are going to close in on them. And they want to get them to a place where they can start the interrogation right away. So they take them to Six Flags, is my note. Is that correct, Paul? Six Flags.
Yeah, it was the Six Flags Inn, which is basically halfway between Fort Worth and Dallas. And it was a hotel which was comprised of villas, so they could order a sort of separate villa, which was away from the other guests.
All right, let's set the scene here. We're in the Six Flags Inn, 2 rooms, adjacent rooms. There are 4 women here. There's Marina, her 2 babies. June is born in February of 62, and Rachel born just a few months before, October
Correct.
of 62. And Marguerite, the mother-in-law, 57, are 2 Secret Service he-men who are going to protect them, but they have to get to the interrogation. And your dad is critical because Marina knows him. His Russian is perfect. And she's fearful that these are the KGB, or that the KGB is coming back, because she's had contact with the FBI, especially one agent named Hosty, contacting her or Lee over the last 2 years in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Immediately, they want to know about the picture. What picture, Paul?
This is the famous picture of Lee dressed in black, holding some kind of radical publication for viewing in the photograph, with the assassination rifle and a pistol on his side. This was of great concern to the Secret Service, because if that picture had been taken by someone other than Marina, they likely had a conspiracy on their hands. On the other hand, Marina had been told by Lee that the FBI in particular was the American KGB, and she should be very wary and have no dealings with them. It was through my father that she came to understand there's the FBI and the Secret Service. The Secret Service is trying to be helpful. The FBI, you have to worry, stay clear of. And that accelerated the interrogation considerably. Marina did not want to confess that she had taken the photograph, because she figured that would be a death sentence or a life sentence. So she was very, very wary of this interrogation, but at least she knew my father.
Meantime, the world is spinning out of control. The Secret Service men and Pete Gregory and others learn, and Robert Oswald, the older brother, learned that Lee Harvey Oswald has been shot and is dead. They don't tell the women right away, but once they do tell Marina and Marguerite, they insist on going to the Parkland Hospital to view the body. I did not know about this scene. Why do they want to see the body? Do they not believe he's dead?
I think, no, my father, when the word first came in that he had been shot, and they did not share this information immediately.
Right.
Later, they did say that he's been shot, but it's not serious. They then went to the sheriff of I forget it.
Arlington, I believe.
Arlington. No, it wasn't Arlington. In fact, everyone got that wrong. It was not Arlington. But it was there that they learned that Lee was dead, and it was my father who told Marina that Lee is dead. And it was the Secret Service that told Marguerite that her son was dead. And at that point, she started demanding that he be buried in Arlington National Cemetery.
Right. Okay. And they do go to the hospital. They do view the body. He's in rough shape, according to your dad.
Yeah.
Then they go back to the hotel because they have to continue the interrogation. And we're going to now turn to the next day, Monday, when the whole world is watching the Kennedy funeral in Washington on black and white televisions. At the same time, Lee Harvey Oswald, the suspect killer, now we know he was the killer, is to be buried very quietly in Texas. The book is The Oswalds. Paul Gregory is the author. We come to the funeral of Lee Harvey Oswald. The president's on television to be buried in Arlington. Marguerite and Marina, with 2 babies, are now going to attempt to bury Lee Harvey Oswald in a cemetery called Rose Hill They have difficulty finding a pastor. They do find a mortuary. And Lee Harvey Oswald, his coffin is carried to the grave by reporters who were on the scene. It's a barren scene, windswept in my imagination, Paul, reading your copy. Marina at this point is what mood, Paul? What did your father say about Marina witnessing all these events? Bang, bang, bang.
Well, his story was that she was constantly smoking and drinking coffee. She was very emotional when they went to Parkland and she viewed the body, and there were certain rituals that Russians perform in such situations, and she performed those rituals. And she then asked, "I want to see the wound," but the attending physicians did not allow her to see the wound. So there was some emotion at that point. I would say she was in a daze, so one would not expect too much. She was watching the Kennedy funeral, and that seemed to impact on her more than anything, because as I say, she was quite admiring of Kennedy, the family, and then seeing Jackie, and seeing Jackie with the kids really destroyed her. So there was some emotion. In fact, they were late for the funeral because she wanted to continue to watch the Kennedy funeral. And then there was sort of an argument between Marina and Marguerite over what dress to wear and trivial things like that.
The mother-in-law, Marguerite, is a difficult person, Paul. She's a very difficult person. She's been difficult her whole life. Does your father pick up on that by this time? Do the Secret Service agents recognize that Marguerite is a problem?
It was rather obvious when she started demanding the Arlington National Cemetery burial. But it got worse and worse. So the secrets and what was driving the Secret Service mad is the fact that she kept asserting that Lee was innocent, had nothing to do with it, and they kept telling her, "Look, we know everything. We know exactly that he did it, and we know how he did it, et cetera, et cetera." So there were open clashes between her and Kunkel and Mike Howard, which really tried their patience. And there came a time when Kunkel in particular just wanted to be rid of her. Later, she did testify, and this is before the Warren Commission, that it was Kunkel and Howard who wanted to murder her. So you can see she was living in a fantasy world.
The interrogation continues for several days. However, at some point, Pete Gregory needs a break, or at least the FBI elbows in and they bring in their own translator, who is not successful in getting Marina to talk. They're trying to get information out to deal with the suspicion dominating at the time and perhaps been lingering all these decades, that this was a conspiracy. As Oswald kept saying before he was murdered, "I'm a patsy. I'm a patsy. I didn't do it." So that was on the television. It wasn't just Marguerite, although Marguerite then fed all of this, as we will learn when we go on to the Warren Commission. But a couple more details. Thanksgiving's coming up, and your family's exhausted. Where are you, Paul, in all of this? Are you calling home? When did you arrive home for Thanksgiving? The day of?
It probably was the day before. So and the interrogation continued on Thanksgiving Day in the morning. So my father did not. And by the way, my father was bound by secrecy not to indicate where the family was being kept in hiding. And in fact, it was the FBI was kept without knowing where they were. And in fact, it was the FBI who came to my father's office to try to find out where they were, where they had the women in hiding. Right. And this created considerable bad will between the FBI and Secret Service.
Eventually, the decision is made by Marina. She needs to get away from her mother-in-law, and they find a place for Marina and the two babies. There are two babies here, squalling, squawking, because of course there's tension in the room, and they haven't they haven't been fed properly for days. Their mother is exhausted, not sleeping, or sleeping very poorly, and she starts out in ill health. I mentioned, Paul, there's a scene where your father and the two agents are driving in a car with Marguerite and the two babies. The babies have diarrhea. It's overwhelming.
Yes.
All of this is going on at the same time, but Marina needs to get away from Marguerite. So they take Marina to the proprietor of the Six Flags Inn, a man named Martin, who will become troublesome in future, but not now. And they separate from Marguerite. And we leave it at this point with your memory of that Thanksgiving. When you're at the table without the Oswalds in the room, what does your mother's name was Elizabeth, is that correct, Paul?
Correct.
What does she make of all of these things? Because your family is under great stress at this point. We have about a minute.
Well, to tell the truth, my memory of that Thanksgiving was something like in a fog.
Yeah.
But my father was a marvelous raconteur, and he went over what he could tell us, I would say in a 2 or 3 hour conversation. My brother-in-law, Joe, actually sort of made notes of this conversation, or this of this telling of events, and published it in the form of a small pamphlet. The thing that struck me most was his description of Marguerite's behavior.
Right.
And nowhere is it mentioned in, I think, in the Warren report, which is quite detailed.
Let's get on to the Warren Commission, Paul. Hold on now.
Sure.
Paul, Gregory, the book is The Oswalds.
Yeah.
The president is dead. Officer Tippit is dead. Lee Harvey Oswald is dead. Jack Ruby will die in future of cancer, is my memory. However, all of these facts, in addition to ones we've not been able to explore, are part of the Warren Commission charge to investigate everything that happened that day, what the assassin before, who the assassin knew, what he talked about. And there are clues in all directions that if you apply the logic of conspiracy thinking, say, well, what about this? And it goes to the fact that not only did America think, and continues to think in large number, that other people were involved in the killing besides this 24-year-old delusional, arrogant, and extremely violent young man, Lee Harvey Oswald, but also at the time, the Presidium of the Soviet Union thought it. They had a meeting immediately when they realized that Lee Harvey Oswald had been somebody they'd pampered for 3 years by giving him his own apartment in Minsk. They'd watched, the KGB had watched him very carefully, using a cutout named Pavel, not only to watch him as a friend in Minsk, but also to continue to correspond with him while he was in Texas. And in one correspondence, Paul's name is mentioned. So there are facts going back and forth with this current cutout. He's not necessarily, his name is Pavel, not necessarily KGB, but he works for the KGB. And there's a very slight distinction in the days of the Cold War. So Paul, we need now to go to your experience of the Warren Commission. You take us to Dealey Plaza on I think right before you're going to testify, you give an affidavit that's going to go to the Warren Commission. When you visited Dealey Plaza, why and what did you make of the explanation that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone?
The reason I wanted to go by Dealey Plaza was just to check with my own eyes how difficult it would have been to make that shot or make those shots. I'd been through Dealey Plaza 20, 30, 40 times in my life because that was the connection to the Dallas-Fort Worth Turnpike. What struck me was that the shot looked to me, to my inexperienced eyes, not knowing much about firearms, that it was a fairly easy shot, because you go down, I can't recall, Elm Street, and in front of you is the Texas School Book Depository. You then have to make a stop and turn to the left and go by the Texas School Book Depository. And Oswald had clearly given this considerable thought, where to locate himself. And at that point where you have to make the left turn, the automobile or the limo is basically not moving. So to me, it looked like a fairly easy shot. So this is what lawyers would call due diligence. I just wanted to see with my own eyes, and I came away with that impression.
A couple of details, however, are important to deal with when you come up with the conspiracy thinking, and we're not following any of them. We're looking at the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone for reasons that might be missing. It might be, Paul introduces in the book that one of the explanations for why we can't solve this is that there was no reason. There was spontaneity, there was wickedness, there was impudence, and there was something in Lee Harvey Oswald that told him he could become important in some fashion with a drama, a dramatic moment. Now, one of the major details that comes to me, Paul, is that when Lee Harvey Oswald came back, I believe from the Mexico adventure, at some point, the friend of the friends of the Dallas Russians led him to apply for the Texas Book Depository job, which he got right away, but that the president's route wasn't established for more than a month after Lee Harvey Oswald got the job. So there was no particular plan. It couldn't have been. They didn't set the president's route through Dallas. As you've said, there was anxiety by the Secret Service because of all the hostility at the time towards the Kennedy administration. They didn't set the route until 4 days before the event itself. That rules out, Paul, a timeline that says that Lee Harvey Oswald planned this any more than spontaneity.
Well, he was spontaneous in this thing. He did think up an excuse for which allowed him to conceal the contents of this wrapped package that he took in with him to work. And indeed, he would have had like 4 or 5 days to figure this out, whereas for the Walker attempted assassination, he worked on it 2-3 weeks. So this was spontaneous. He would also have had to look up the bus schedule. It's a very bizarre way for a presidential assassin to flee the scene in the city bus. But it's very difficult to look at these series of coincidences without latching onto one thing that causes you to think that it was a conspiracy. Even the Gregory family in some quarters is claims are made that we were part of all this. We were representatives of this radical Russian community in Dallas. My father was in the oil business, and there were oil interests who wanted Kennedy out of the way. So I can tell you for sure we were not a part of any conspiracy, but that theory is still floating, by the way, and it probably originated in Moscow.
Yes, because Moscow is trying to defend itself. The reason we have the Oswald file is because the Soviet Union fell apart at the end of '91. And Yeltsin, who became president of what remained of the Soviet Empire, released the file for scholars. And Paul has looked at the file, others have looked at the file, and it's thorough. And it also is a source of why the Soviets think he did it, because the Soviets don't want to be involved in any fashion. There's one little detail, Paul, that springs out at you as to warn anyone who's trying to reconstruct a crime from the crime itself backwards to the original thinking. The man that Oswald interviews in the Soviet embassy in Mexico City is an illegal. That is, he's KGB posing as an embassy officer. He's not only a KGB agent officer, he's also of the 13th Department, which is my memory is, or I think I looked this up because so that's a department was used once upon a time for what was called wet work, assassination. They were the bully boys. And so if you want to build this backwards, you can find facts like that, cherry pick the facts to come up with an Oswald who was directed by the assassination conspiracy. However, Paul, you're very careful about this, and we're going to get on to your thinking about 50, 60 years later, why Oswald remains the lone shooter and we don't need anyone else. But your testimony before the Warren Commission was very clear. Your father's testimony before the Warren Commission was very clear, straightforward, and we've touched on many of the facts. Marguerite Oswald before the Warren Commission overwhelms me, Paul, with revelations. What do you learn from the way she conducted herself before Chief Justice Warren?
Well, I originally had no intention to write an entire chapter about Marguerite, but as you yourself have seen, this is an incredible event where this dumpy nurse sets herself the goal of going against Earl Warren, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And she had these crazy stories about Lee, about his childhood, about how he's actually a hero. And she actually demanded of the Warren Commission, of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, that he give her subpoena rights, because her argument was that her hero son was not represented, did not have legal representation in front of the Warren Commission, and she was going to correct this injustice. So here's obviously, I think one can use the term deranged woman, thought that she could dominate the Warren Commission study of what happened. So she's an incredible story, and her story is extremely important because she is the mother of Lee Harvey Oswald, who had two brothers who Marguerite farmed out to orphanages. They turned out just fine. Lee did not. So one could really not understand Oswald without understanding Marguerite.
She had marriages, she had divorces, she had 3 sons by 2 different fathers. She traveled from Texas to New Orleans to New York. Her son was always Lee Harvey Oswald, whom she called the boy consistently, was always in trouble, violent trouble, Paul. You tell a story about how his older brother, Robert Oswald, took him hunting for rabbits when they were in Texas, I presume. And Robert gave Lee Oswald, a rifle and a shot at a rabbit nearby. He shot the rabbit right away, but then he continued to shoot bullets into the dead carcass. Almost in what you'd have to say was a moment of craziness, just adolescent craziness. But there are other violence, pulling knife on one of the relatives of his half brother, the Picks. He hit his mother at one point. We know he beat Marina. So and it's not conclusive. A violent temper doesn't necessarily lead you to be an assassin. But Marguerite deliberately involved everybody into the conspiracy thinking. She planted it. She hired Mark Lane, correct, Paul? She brought Lane in. And Lane is the author of all the craziness about the CIA killing Kennedy.
There's no doubt that a major explanatory factor in virtually everything that Lee Harvey Oswald did in his lifetime can be traced back to the influence of his mother.
And your reading of her with and before Earl Warren, do you believe that the Warren Commission, the people participating, because these were earnest men and women pursuing this for months, did they understand that Marguerite was the explanation that is not an explanation, but it is a drama that Lee Harvey Oswald would have experienced when he was a child, being dragged behind his mom?
They clearly understood this. Justice Warren was warned that this is going to happen in her open testimony, but they decided to let her speak, let her demonstrate her craziness to the world, and they somehow maintained their composure during her testimony, where her constant complaint was that Howard and Kunkel never took any testimony from her. My father witnessed Howard deposing Marguerite, and everyone associated with Six Flags Inn knew about this, but they still treated her very graciously, and so it would have been evident to everyone that they were dealing with a loose cannon.
The book is The Oswalds. Paul Gregory is the author. This is an untold account of Marina and Lee Oswald and Marguerite Oswald and Robert Oswald, the older brother, and John Pix, the half-brother. But it's also the story of how the Gregory family stood up to an unprecedented amount of scrutiny in the Warren Commission. All their names are in the Warren Commission. The investigation, the conspiracy thinking, the blame shifting that went on for decades now continues about the Dallas Russians. But it comes down to motive, Paul. In Sherlock Holmes' world, you need a weapon, you need opportunity, and you need a motive. What was the motive to your reasoning all these decades later? You knew all the principles, Paul, and they're all gone but you.
And Marina.
Marina, who won't talk to you, will not talk.
Will not talk, yeah. The motive, I think, is fairly simple, and it's well known, but there's a sort of sub-motive, which I'll say a word or two about. The motive was that Lee Harvey Oswald, from his early years on, living with his mother, had been told, you are special, you have a destiny to fulfill, the world is against you, I'm warning you, it's going to be a tough life, and we are not going to be treated favorably in life. You're going to have a tough life. Everybody's against you. Lee somehow, even though he was dyslexic, was a voracious reader, and he read biographies. He read a lot of Marx and Lenin and things like that. We tend to underestimate Lee's mental abilities because of the dyslexia. He could not spell. He did not know the word T-O. Everything was T-O-O. And so if you focus on that, and by the way, he never graduated from high school. He was a bad student. He was a disciplinary problem. So we tend to underestimate him. But in the book, I talk about the remarkable achievements, if you want to call them that, of Lee Harvey Oswald. As an 18-year-old, he bamboozled the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union by coming up with the idea of, they want to get rid of me, so I will pretend to commit suicide and they can't get rid of me. He persuaded the U.S. Moscow consul to give him the money for he and Marina to return to the United States. He was a master manipulator. We learn from the affair of General Walker that he was a good planner. He and his family could live on virtually no money. So if you look at what he accomplished, if you want to call it an accomplishment, it's rather remarkable. We tend to see the high school dropout, the person who could not spell T-O, but that's not Oswald. The real Oswald is a very tricky, manipulative guy who manipulated his wife, kept her quiet, even after she learned that he had tried to assassinate a political figure. So the one thing I would say is, one issue is we have underestimated Oswald. And I think that's one of the major points of the book.
Jack Ruby murders Oswald and deprives us of knowing full details about how he put together the plot to kill the president in his own mind. In those 4 days, he knew the president was going to be driving by his place of work. Jack Ruby kept us from learning more. What can you speculate Oswald believed was going to happen in the trial of Oswald? What would he have said? We have a couple of minutes, Paul.
The trial was to be his glorious moment where he would demonstrate to the world and also to Marina, because Marina is a subplot here. He was going to demonstrate his brilliance. He was going to be on national TV, international TV. He could talk about his theories of Marxism, Leninism. He was going to go down in history as a great figure. So that's what he was going to do. Marina was a big factor in this as well, because whereas he had these visions of grandeur, she kept telling him, you're kind of worthless, you're not a real man. So I would add that as a plot, as part of the explanation for what he did. Marina was a major figure in that regard.
You tell us when she took the photograph, dressed in black with his 1995 rifle and his 2995 pistol, she laughed at him. What did he make of that laugh, Paul? We have just a few seconds.
Well, I can't know what he made of this, but I would characterize her attitudes towards the things that he regarded as important was scorn. So he was nothing. He was a little guy, and we learned from other research that there were sexual problems within the marriage as well. So, and there were occasions where she said, my husband, he isn't a real man. So what better way to prove to your wife, and this was a strange love affair. What better way to prove to your wife that you are something by killing the president?
Paul Gregory of the Hoover Institution. The book is The Oswalds, an untold account of Marina and Lee Harvey Oswald, November 22nd, 1963, in infamy. I'm John Batchelor.